Sorry, just a second.
Good evening and welcome. It's really nice to welcome everyone on this nice spring evening. And I hope that you can take your laptop outside maybe and participate with us this evening. But before we begin tonight, I want to mention about our next program, which is on Wednesday, April the 27th. And this is a dinner at the Madison Club. And it's a sit-down dinner, and I will tell you that it's not possible just to come to hear the speaker that evening. You must come to the dinner. And the reservation must be in by April 19th. And our speaker that evening will be Dr. Hannah Chapman of Miami University, and she will be speaking about Putin's Russia, which of course couldn't be a more timely topic for us to have. So be sure to have that on your calendar, and be sure to note April 19th as the deadline for making your dinner reservation. Now, this evening, we are having our third in the series of the rise of authoritarianism in the world. And we're really fortunate to have with us somebody who knows about this subject, particularly in the country of Brazil. Dr. Amy Erica Smith is Associate Professor of Political Science and also the Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Professor at Iowa State University. Dr. Smith took her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and has specialized in Latin America, particularly in Brazil. Her areas of research have been citizenship, democracy, and religion. And she has recently returned from doing a postdoc as a Fulbright scholar in Brazil, and is also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. She's written 2 books on the subject, and the last one was Mobilizing God's People, and this was published in 2019. And so I think also we know that she has written a lot in academic articles, in academic journals, and has appeared numerous times on the media. So she'll be talking with us about Bolsonaro's Brazil. And I would also call your attention to the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Click on the chat icon and the page will show to your right. Put your questions there. And when Dr. Smith has completed her presentation, I will pose the questions to her. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you to all of you who are attending. I can't really see you all, but I hope that I will be able to at least chat with you virtually later on in the evening. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk about where Brazil is. It's at an interesting moment and a difficult moment, and one that I hope I'll convince you is of global importance. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Sorry. Didn't have it. Hold on. Okay, can you all see my presentation here? Are you seeing the presentation full screen? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Bolsonaro's Brazil. This is a photo that I love of people walking on the in front of the presidential palace in Brasilia. So this is a photo of President Jair Bolsonaro using his slogan from his presidential campaign. This slogan reads in English, Brazil above everyone, or above everything, God above everyone. So this slogan is a sort of a Christian nationalist slogan that has epitomizes his understanding of religion and country, his focus on themes of right-wing nationalism within his campaign that have persisted to this day. So in this talk, I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to start off by talking with you about Bolsonaro's rise. I'll give you a little bit of background on him and his backstory. I'm going to talk with you then about his performance in office. I'm going to pick just a very narrow slice of his performance in office. I'm not going to tell you, there's a lot of things I could talk about, including especially his performance on COVID. I am not going to talk about his performance on COVID, but I could talk a lot about that in the question and answer if you're curious. And then I'm going to end up by talking a little bit about what's next. This is an election year in Brazil, and it's a critical election for the globe, I think. I'm going to argue. Okay, so start off by talking about Bolsonaro's rise in the 2018 election. So this is President Jair Bolsonaro when he was a captain in the army. So Bolsonaro's rise to the public stage began during his military service in the 1980s. So when he entered the military, Brazil was a military regime. So he was a low-ranking officer and didn't have any major responsibilities, certainly not responsible for the military's repression in any serious way, but he was invested in Brazil's military dictatorship that lasted from 1964 to 1985. So beginning in the 1970s, he was born in the 1950s. Beginning in the 1970s, he was, as a young man, he was really interested in military service and entered the military. Sought to enter the military to volunteer. He tried to volunteer, helping the military even when he was a teenager, entered the military as soon as he could when he was 18, eventually rose to the rank of captain. He, one of his commanding officers later reminisced about him. He was constantly trying to lead the lower ranking officers and was always repelled, both because of his aggressive treatment of his comrades and because of the lack of logic, rationality, and balance in the way he presented his arguments. So maybe the quintessential moment of Bolsonaro's early career before entering politics was his staging of a rebellion on an army base in where he was stationed. So he in the state of Rio. So Bolsonaro, during the transition to democracy, shortly after the transition to democracy, the country was undergoing severe inflation, and all salaries were compressed. So Bolsonaro was unhappy about the level of salaries in Brazil, and he began publishing letters to the editor in major magazines. So he managed to get a letter to the editor published in the national news magazine, Veja, complaining that salaries were too low. The headline here literally reads, "Salaries are too low." So he got some letters to the editor published. He was known as sort of a complaining type within the military. Not surprisingly, his commanding officers were not happy about his complaints. This led to some minor reprimands against him, which led him to escalate his complaints, actually. So this escalated to the point that he and a fellow military officer, low-ranking military officer, came up with an idea to stage a to stage a minor rebellion on a military base. They were going to set off bombs in some barracks and in some bathrooms on the military base. The goal was, as they said, not to really, hurt anybody, but just to scare some people into understanding that that things had to change. So they, Bolsonaro and a companion end up hatching this plot to stage a rebellion on a military base. They are, they end up talking to a journalist about the story. They confess their plot to a journalist. They think they're off their record. The journalist goes to her editor and says, these two guys have told me about their plot to stage a rebellion on a military base. Should I publish it, or is it off the record? And of course, her editor says, absolutely, you should publish it. So this journalist publishes this massive scoop about how, there are some low-ranking military officers who are going to stage a rebellion on the base. This leads to, him spending some time in jail, and he's going to be expelled from the military, go to prison for this. And then what happens? This extraordinary thing happens. All of this activism on his part has started to make him really, really popular among low-ranking military officers and enlisted men within the army. And so a wave of letters defending him come into start to arrive, supporting him and asking his commanding officers to let him off, asking the military courts to let him off in late 1987 and early 1988. So all of these letters come in, and eventually the courts, the judges end up letting him off on a technicality, saying they can't prove that the handwriting on the plans is his. And so he's quietly let go from the military without a dishonorable discharge. The agreement is basically that if he leaves the military quietly, they will just let him go and not pursue him any further. So this is Bolsonaro's story of how he rises. So once he's expelled from the military, he now has this basically a political base of military men and enlisted men who are his biggest fans. And he uses this base of support to start to run for office. He first runs for city council in the city of Rio de Janeiro. After a few years in city council, he ends up running for federal deputy. And then he spends about 30 years in Congress as a federal deputy. Federal deputy is basically a member of the lower chamber of commerce, like the lower chamber of Congress, equivalent to a member of the House of Representatives. So he ends up spending about 30 years as basically a member of the Brazilian House of Representatives. He never consistently joins one single party. He's always known as being sort of a right-wing fringe figure who has a very strong base of support among police officers and the military within Rio. And he switches around from one party to another. He's not known particularly for being a strong legislator in terms of championing legislation or negotiating with other politicians or parties or things like that, but he maintains this quite long career. So when he started to run for office, across international news, if you started to read international news during the 2018 presidential election in Brazil, you would come across sort of long lists of Bolsonaro's, what we might call euphemistically, greatest hits. His things that he has said that are offensive by most democratic standards, by most political standards. So within the Brazilian political context, it had been thought that people couldn't run for office if they said these things. So here's one quote. He told a female federal deputy, "I wouldn't rape you, you don't deserve it." When asked to clarify what he meant, he said, "She doesn't deserve to be raped because she's very ugly. She's not my type, I'd never rape her. I'm not a rapist, but if I was, I wouldn't rape her because she doesn't deserve it." He's said things like, "I wouldn't employ women and men with the same salary, but there are a lot of competent women." The dictatorship's mistake was to torture but not kill political dissidents. When he voted to impeach President Dilma Rousseff, who was from an opposition party or a different party from him, to whom he was opposed. In 2016, she was on the center left. He dedicated his vote to her impeachment, to the memory of the military general from the military dictatorship who had tortured her. This is Colonel Carlos Alberto Villanchi Ustra. So he's dedicated, this is a famous torturer and sort of all-around bad guy from the Brazilian military regime. He had once said in 2011 that he would rather have his son die in a car accident than show up with a boyfriend. He has told Black activists in 2013 to go back to the zoo. So these are the kinds of things that he was known for saying. Political scientists, pundits around the world warned that electing Bolsonaro would potentially mean the downfall of Brazilian democracy. So Scott Mainwaring, an eminent political scientist from Harvard and also University of Notre Dame, here saying this is a really radical shift. I can't think of a more extremist leader in the history of democratic elections in Latin America who's been elected. That's right after his election in 2018. Stephen Levitsky, also from Harvard, said it's much more likely Brazilian democracy will die at the hands of an elected leader as a result of Bolsonaro's election. And at the same time, he was really very, very popular. This is a photo from shortly after Bolsonaro was elected. The person waving the can here, smoke, he's wearing the colors of the Brazilian flag. When Bolsonaro ran for office, he used the colors of the Brazilian flag. And actually, the Brazilian right adopted the colors of the Brazilian flag and basically made them its claim to fame was the colors of the Brazilian flag, the point where leftists stopped using the colors of the Brazilian flag. This person here is saying, this t-shirt says, "My party is Brazil." In other words, the claim is that Brazil, that the coalition of right-wing groups that elected Bolsonaro were nonpartisan. They were simply in favor of Brazil. Here's another person who's dressed up as an indigenous person who says, Bolsonaro is the people. So really very highly popular in certain circles. Here, right after he was elected, there were military parades from military people who were celebrating, or informal parades, not actual military parades, but informal celebrations from military officers who were celebrating Bolsonaro's win, though they were not supposed to be, they're not supposed to be engaged in this kind of activity. So let's talk about how he ends up getting elected. Part of the story by which Bolsonaro gets elected is related to what we might call the fundamentals of Brazil's 2018 election. So the 2018 election came at the end of 4 consecutive terms of the center-left PT party, which is the party that included the former president Dilma Rousseff, whom I mentioned earlier. And any party, any person who had ended up in the second round election opposed to the PT would have very likely won against the PT, because the PT was at that moment, it was the incumbent party in some senses. The Dilma Rousseff had been impeached, and so there was an interim office holder who was not affiliated with her party, but still there was widespread anger against the Workers' Party or the PT, and anybody who had gone up against the PT, had gotten into the second round against the PT, would have very likely won no matter what. So the things that were going on in the 2018 election was really low performance of the Workers' Party, which had long been the dominant party in Brazilian politics. The economy was doing terribly. The country was in recession. Actually, the country has never fully recovered from a recession that began in 2014. So the economy was doing terribly. There had been massive corruption scandals that had tarnished most major parties, but because the PT was running or was in the presidency during these major scandals, of course, it affected the PT more than other parties. And it was, it had tarnished the PT's reputation more than it had tarnished other parties. There was widespread public pessimism about the state of the country in 2018. So my colleague Matthew Layton and I had done some interviews in 2017. This is one poignant quote from somebody that we interviewed, a young person who said, it's a sort of complicated business, I think, to not have hope. I never ever thought about leaving Brazil, but if I did not have family here, I would have already gone. So this is the moment in which Bolsonaro ends up winning enough votes to go into the second round against the PT, and then he ends up winning. There's also widespread increasing opposition to the Workers' Party, or PT. So in the Brazilian context, opposition to the PT is called antipetismo. So there's growing sort of polarization about, do you like or do you dislike the PT? And so Brazilian politics is famously multi-partisan. There are parties all across there are about 30 parties or so at any given point in Brazilian politics. But at the moment that that Bolsonaro is elected, or at the moment of the 2018 election, politics has really come down to a question of, do you like the PT or do you not like the PT? So, of course, the candidates who end up running are not just generic figures. They are Fernando Haddad, who's the candidate from the Workers' Party, or PT, who takes first place in the first round election, versus Bolsonaro is the candidate who takes second place in the first round election. And then Bolsonaro takes first place and Fernando Haddad takes second place. What am I saying? Yeah, so Bolsonaro takes first place, while Fernando Haddad takes second place, and they're going to a second round election. And in this context, it's highly likely that Bolsonaro is going to be the candidate who's going to win. This also takes place in the context of Brazil's culture wars. So there had been a growing movement for LGBTQ rights in Brazil over the past 2 decades, really, but then increasingly over the decade prior to the 2018 election. Same-sex marriage was legalized in Brazil in a set of Supreme Court decisions in 2011 and then 2013. And so we had same-sex marriage, which had become an issue in the culture wars. We had gender identity as well, had become an issue within the culture wars. This is a photo from one of the first same-sex marriages. At the same time, we also had a rapid rise in evangelicalism in Brazilian politics. This rapid rise in evangelicalism actually touched Jair Bolsonaro himself. This is a photo of Jair Bolsonaro's baptism in the Jordan River by a prominent evangelical. This person here who's baptizing him is a prominent evangelical politician himself, who actually had run for office in 2014, got a very, very small percentage of the vote. In any case, this prominent Brazilian politician or leading evangelical figure had baptized Bolsonaro in the river. Bolsonaro has done something really interesting, basically unprecedented in Brazilian politics, by sort of straddling a line between evangelical and Catholic. So Bolsonaro was raised Catholic, continues to say that he's Catholic, but he's married to an evangelical woman, attends an evangelical church. A number of his adult children have converted to evangelicalism. So he really kind of is identified with both social worlds, and he is deliberately ambiguous about where he stands on sort of a Catholic versus evangelical divide, and is really kind of identified with generic Christian nationalism and not with particularly evangelical versus Catholic nationalism. This is in a larger context where the Brazilian religious landscape has been changing dramatically. So I'm showing you data here that only go through 2010. That Brazil's 2020 census was never conducted, which is a failure of the Bolsonaro administration as well as a casualty of COVID. The latest census data we have are from 2010, but the estimates are that evangelical affiliation is, this is Catholic affiliation right here. The estimates are that Catholic affiliation is down to the mid-50s. So a little over half, slightly over half of Brazilians today likely identify as Catholic. And a little over a third of Brazilians today, around 33, 34% of Brazilians today likely identify as evangelical. So there's been massive change in the Brazilian landscape where Catholicism will within this decade become a minority religion in Brazil, and evangelicalism has been dramatically rising. Evangelical churches, this is a poster here from a church that I participated in and observed in the city of Juiz de Fora in 2014. This is a poster showing the number of services a day. So this is a way of writing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So each day has its own theme of church services. This is a poster from the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, and they have services all day long from 6:30 in the morning, 8 a.m., 10 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., and 7:30 p.m. On Monday, you can attend worship service at the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. So this is the worship schedule that they maintain at the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. So these are the kinds of services. This is a kind of religious effervescence, the kind of extreme levels of religious participation in certain Pentecostal and evangelical churches. So not only is evangelicalism rising, but evangelicalism is really very highly active. And evangelicalism has become increasingly socially and politically conservative in Brazil. Evangelicalism was not always historically particularly politically conservative. It was socially conservative in certain ways, but as the culture wars have become more acute, evangelicalism and Pentecostalism have become increasingly identified with the political right in Brazil. So the 2018 presidential election was in part about religion, guns, and sexuality politics. This is a picture of Jair Bolsonaro from the 2019 March for Jesus, which was an event that, while it doesn't have an evangelical name in the title, is really largely an evangelical event. So he deliberately courted evangelical voters in various ways. So this is actually a t-shirt from 2019, but he certainly courted them during his campaign as well. There were also widespread fake news stories about things like about his opponent that spread stories across social media that were fake news stories. This is a photo of a post that says where his opponent Fernando Haddad is saying that people are saying that, claiming that his opponent Fernando Haddad said that they're going to forcibly transgender children. They're going to take 5 years old, and at the age of 5, the state is going to decide what a child's sex should be. The Brazilian government knows what's best for your children. So there's this fake news story running around about how Fernando Haddad is going to make your children transgender. This is from another fake news story that said that when Fernando Haddad was mayor of the city of São Paulo, they passed out erotic bottles to children in daycare. So yeah, this is the kind of environment in which the Bolsonaro was running for office in 2018. There was widespread violation of sort of campaign laws with respect to how you're able to campaign via social media, via WhatsApp. And this is the kind of thing that was happening via social media. At the same time, there were also campaign effects in churches. So this is from a survey that I conducted in Brazil in 2018 with some co-authors. We find that the probability of switching to Bolsonaro was very high. So this is the probability of reporting a change to support Bolsonaro between September and November, waves 2 and 4 of the survey. We find that that almost 60% of Pentecostals whom we interviewed in September who weren't initially interested in supporting Bolsonaro would eventually switch to him over the course of the campaign. In other words, there was just very high levels of switching to support Bolsonaro within certain kinds of churches, especially Pentecostal churches, but also evangelical non-Pentecostal churches. Catholic, whereas there was only 20% chance that a Catholic who wasn't supporting Bolsonaro in September of the election campaign would subsequently support him 2 months later. We also found very high levels of self-reported discussion of the election in churches, especially in Pentecostal churches. So about 70% of Pentecostals and over 65% of evangelicals said that there was discussion of the election in their church. And a large number of Pentecostals and evangelicals said that their clergy had supported Bolsonaro in the election. So high levels of discussion. And yeah, so this is the same study that says that basically there was high levels of support. Okay, so let's talk about his performance in office. So I'm only going to hit on a few themes because I don't have a lot of time and I want to leave time for questions and answers. The first is that he has maintained the culture wars while in office. This picture here is of a person who's famous in Brazil and not really famous in the United States, though he actually spent the remainder of his life in the United States, lived in the United States during his pretty much all his entire rise to prominence in Brazil. So this is a guy named Olavo de Carvalho, who is widely known as Bolsonaro's guru. He's known for having a YouTube channel with anti-cultural Marxist screeds he is a self-proclaimed philosopher. He has written a number of books that people like Bolsonaro have adopted. Olavo de Carvalho just passed away about a month and a half ago or so. So he's no longer obviously a figure on the Brazilian scene, but he was widely known as sort of the intellectual mastermind or guru behind Bolsonaro's rise. Within Brazil, he was widely compared to Steve Bannon. So these are two of Bolsonaro's sons who have been running a social media campaign to maintain sort of the tenor of the culture wars. And this is Bolsonaro's education minister. So the culture war, he is widely perceived as having tried to ramp up and maintain the culture war through social media, through just general opposition to COVID vaccinations, all kinds of things. At the same time, he's been extremely unpopular. So he may have a culture war that he's running via social media and via certain cultural elites, but this red line here is disapproval for Bolsonaro from the beginning. So he starts off 2019 with really low levels of popularity and pretty high levels of popularity. So 49% approval in 2019 and only 11% disapproval when he first takes office on January 1st, 2019. But by September of 2019, he's already risen to 34% disapproval. So he's underwater already by late 2019, and his disapproval just continues to rise. So he has been a really highly unpopular president despite everything that led to him getting elected. And his approval ratings have stuck in the, they've gotten as low as 19% at some point in late 2021, risen to 28% in February of this year. Okay. But the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is environmental disaster. I can also, as I said, talk about Brazil's COVID experience, which has really been tragic. But right now I want to talk about what's happening with respect to the environment in Brazil. So you may have seen recent headlines talking about deforestation in the Amazon and how the Amazon may be reaching a tipping point. The tipping point is one where what ecologists call the tipping point will be one where the Amazon no longer has sufficient tree cover to produce its own rain and its own moisture, and it starts to dry itself out. And that's, scientists estimate, it's not clear exactly where the tipping point will be, but the tipping point will be probably somewhere around 25% to 30% deforested, something like that. The Amazon is currently at about 18% deforested, 19%, something like that. There are already signs that the Brazilian rainforest or the Amazon rainforest across the Amazon region, which doesn't include only Brazil. Brazil has the majority of the Amazon rainforest, but the entire Amazon rainforest is already in places starting to actually be a net carbon emitter in certain places where where there has been deforestation. And there are signs that the forest is regenerating more slowly than it used to, which is a sign that the forest is drying itself out and is not able to maintain itself over the long run. If the Amazon passes the tipping point, a process could kick in which what they call savannization takes over, where the forest is no longer able to maintain itself, that there's no longer sufficient rain to maintain, and it switches to a savanna type climate where the rainforest starts to disappear. It's not clear that if it passes the tipping point, the entire Amazon is going to transition all at once, but it will happen. So in addition, this deforestation is largely happening through burning, which is largely man-made forest fires. In addition, as the forest starts to dry itself out, we have increasingly we also have natural or so-called natural forest fires, non-man-made, when not set by human beings, forest fires that are not set by human beings, but the large majority of the fires in Brazil are set by human beings, largely as a part of slash and burn agriculture, though there are other reasons that you set fires as well to the forest, to clear forest. This has already also gone along with encroachment on indigenous territories. So this is an indigenous person who has come across mining within an area within the territory. So much of the Brazil's Amazon is controlled or owned by the federal government, but people are encroaching into the land to clear land, to occupy land, and also they're encroaching into indigenous territory. So a lot of the Brazilian rainforest is set aside for indigenous people. This has gone along with severe drought in South America. There have been waves of drought. There was a drought between 2014 and 2017, and drought came back in 2020. It was just recently ended. So there's a drought between 2020 and late 2021 when deluge, a flooding began in Brazil. So if the Amazon rainforest disappeared, one estimate is that global temperature, this would contribute about 0.25 degrees C to global temperature rise. And in some local places, it would make temperatures up to 4.5 degrees C hotter in certain places within the Amazon region itself, because the Amazon is such an important moderator of the local climate and local temperature conditions. So none of this is unexpected. This is a product of public policy. When Bolsonaro was running for office in 2018, he made it clear that he was considering withdrawing from the Paris Accords. He ended up not withdrawing from the Paris Accords, but he talked about it during the campaign. This is a quote here from him where he says, where he suggested that people should, was kind of making a joke about how you could protect the rainforest. And he says that maybe what you should do to protect the rainforest is go to the bathroom less often. So go to the bathroom every other day in order to reduce environmental pollution. At the same time, there's very high levels of anxiety and concern about the environment in Brazil. In early 2019, 78% of Brazilians said that they thought that would experience that Brazil would experience very serious harm if climate change went unchecked. And 25% of Brazilians said that it was very likely that their family would suffer death or serious harm from natural disasters. So there's very high levels of anxiety. And more recent public opinion polls show that anxiety keeps rising in Brazil. So Brazilian citizens are quite concerned. And yet, at the same time, we have a situation where politicians have been elected and who make it very difficult to pursue these things. In August 2019, when there was a rash of forest fires, 89% of Brazilians told the media that they agreed that the government should do more. What's contributing to climate change and deforestation then is entrenched special interests. So we have mining across the Amazon region. This is often sort of wildcat mining using mercury in rivers, including the Amazon River itself. So it's mining for gold, for other minerals, timber, and agriculture. So a lot of what's happening is the land which is cleared through slash and burn agriculture or through other methods of clearing the land. Land is cleared and then planted, and then the soil is really highly nutrient rich at the moment that the rainforest is cleared, and then the nutrients are depleted shortly thereafter. So there's also high levels of illegal occupation of public property. So much of the land within the Brazilian rainforest is owned by the public sector or by indigenous groups. It's set aside as indigenous reservations, but it's very, very common for people to come in and illegally occupy public lands and make up land titles for themselves for the public lands, which is obviously fraudulent. There's a process of the word in Portuguese is literally cricketing. They use a cricket to falsify old papers. The idea is that if you put crickets on old papers, at least this is sort of the urban legend, the old story of how this used to happen was that people would put papers that like fake titles to land in a box with a bunch of crickets, and the crickets poop all over the papers and make the papers look old. So there's lots of falsification of land titles happening. And then periodically, everybody knows that falsification of land titles is happening, and periodically there will be an amnesty where the Brazilian Congress legalizes all of the illegal occupation of land titles. This is also happening, this is a former president of the Chamber of Deputies, Rodrigo Maia. This is happening with congressional approval, in large part because there are entrenched special interests are also within Congress. And to some extent with support from evangelical groups, not so much because evangelical groups are supporting illegal land occupation, but because evangelical groups are interested in proselytizing to indigenous people. So this is Damaris Alves, the Minister for Women, Family, and Culture, who is herself an evangelical and who has been prominent in trying to promote illegal occupation illegal evangelism within indigenous territories. This headline here says that the National Agency for Indians, or the indigenous people, plans to make a person who evangelized to the indigenous people responsible for taking care of isolated Indian tribes, that is, tribes that are supposedly uncontacted or not supposed to be contacted very much. So in terms of what can be done, a lot of my research, my current research, is focusing on how religious groups are mobilizing to try to support environmental protection. In addition, so there's really, really important work being done by ecologists who are working on developing what they call a standing forest economy. So working on trying to develop economic and business models that help indigenous people and people living within the Amazon rainforest, including settlers, that is to say people who migrated to the territory within the past 40 years, help them learn how to develop economic models that allow them to make income from within the forest. So this, for instance, is a picture of the acai berry, which is a crop that grows naturally within the Brazilian rainforest. So they're talking about cultivation, for instance, of one crop would be the acai berry, that to try to develop this as a crop within the forest that allows the forest to remain standing. So these two scientists here are Carlos Nobre and Thomas Lovejoy, who've been instrumental in trying to develop this model for the economy. Okay, so what's next? I've got just a few minutes left to talk with you all. So the most important thing to talk about what's next in the Brazilian election is that it's almost certainly going to come down to a two-way contest. I mean, there will be other people in the race, but the two top front runners will be Bolsonaro and this guy, Lula. He is generally known, he's known worldwide by the one name moniker Lula. His longer name is Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva. So Lula was president of Brazil from 2003 to 2010. Barack Obama once called him the most popular politician on earth. He was extremely popular and during his 2 terms in office. He was so popular during his 2 terms in office that he was basically able to handpick his own successor, this woman, Dilma Rousseff, who was subsequently impeached in 2016. So in 2016, he was not so popular. But in 2018, he was not so popular. Even so, if he had been allowed to run for election in 2018, he very likely would have beat Bolsonaro in 2018. He was disqualified from running for office in a series of legal maneuvers which were of questionable constitutionality, but that temporarily, momentarily got him disqualified for running for office. His opponents were able to get him disqualified from running for office in 2018. This was part of a flirtation with authoritarianism in Brazil, movement towards left authoritarianism. In any case, he was disqualified from running for office in 2018. He is now qualified again for running for office. He's been absolved of legal charges. And he is very likely to win this election. He probably would have won in 2018 if he had won, and he is very likely to win now. He is from the center-left Workers' Party, or PT. He is likely to have better environmental performance, though he's still going to be facing this Congress with these entrenched special interests. So we can expect Lula in 2022. He's definitely running for office, though candidacies have not officially been announced, but with 99.9% certainty, knock on, like, barring any unforeseen circumstances, he will be a candidate, and he is likely to be the winner. At the same time, Christian churches have started to take, particularly Pentecostal churches, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which was a large supporter of Bolsonaro in 2018, has already started to take a very strong stance against Lula and against support for the left. Here we have the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God says it's impossible to be a Christian and vote for the left. So people are taking sides, churches are taking sides already. So while Lula is very likely to win, the race is tightening. So this headline here says that Bolsonaro is improving. Bolsonaro's performance, vote intentions for Bolsonaro are improving in the North region, the Center-West region, and the South region. Lula is preserving his support in the Southeast and the Northeast. So this here is a Lula versus Bolsonaro poll. So showing his performance in November 2021 and March of 2022. So in the North region, Lula fell from 57% of vote intentions to 43% of vote intentions. Bolsonaro rose from 18% of vote intentions to 30% of vote intentions between November and March of 2022, etc. Northeast, Lula remains stable at 60%. He remains stable at 42% in the Southeast, but he's fallen in the Center-West. Actually, the only region where Bolsonaro is coming out on top is in the Center-West region. In any case, the Center-West region, by the way, is a large agribusiness region, so Lula is still likely to win, but the race is getting tighter. One reason that that the race is getting tighter is because there has been a massive injection of cash into the race, with Bolsonaro unleashing federal spending. This headline here says that Bolsonaro's approval has risen among recipients of Brazil's new welfare program. So Bolsonaro was able to push through a reform to welfare policy that increased welfare spending. So people who are now receiving welfare spending, and that's a large portion of the Brazilian population, something like 30 to 40% right now are receiving some kind of welfare. So people who are receiving welfare are increasingly likely to support Bolsonaro. Okay, so this wraps up the talk. I'm going to conclude. I just wanted to let you know, this is a copy of my book. My next book is going to be called something like The Burning Bush, Religion and Climate Change in Latin America. A lot of this research has been supported by all of these wonderful funders, and thanks to them. Okay, so thank you all so much for listening through the talk. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you, and I'm delighted to take any questions.
Dr. Smith, I have to tell you that we have encountered a major technical problem during your presentation.
Oh no.
And as such, I'm going to ask you a few questions that will sort of repeat some of the information you gave early on when some people had the wrong link, etc.
Oh no.
Yes. Oh yes. Anyway,
was it recorded? It was recorded, right? Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's recorded. Yeah, it's recorded, so
Good.
they can go back and listen. But some of them have gotten on now, and so I would like to ask. You were mentioning about his support of evangelical Christians, and was he himself an evangelical Christian, or what was his religious background?
Yeah, so Bolsonaro was raised Catholic and continues to identify as being Catholic himself. He, but he's been unusual in Brazilian politics. I'm not actually aware of any other politician who has done this so successfully, of sort of straddling the world between evangelical and Catholic affiliation. So he says that he is Catholic, but his wife is evangelical. He attends an evangelical church with his wife. A number of his adult children have converted to evangelicalism. And he was baptized in the Jordan River by a prominent evangelical politician. Mm-hmm. So when Brazilian voters are asked in a survey, I conducted a survey where I asked Brazilian voters, do you think that Bolsonaro is evangelical or Catholic? Just over half were able to correctly identify his religious affiliation as Catholic, but nearly half of voters thought that he was evangelical.
So a lot of the people who were Catholic have sort of moved to evangelical.
Yeah, so there has been widespread conversion to evangelicalism within Brazil.
Yeah.
The percentage evangelical has declined from, the percentage Catholic has declined from around 90% in 1970 to just over half today, somewhere around 55% or so of Brazilians today.
You spoke about the terrible environmental disaster there. What is his position on the environment, and what does he understand that needs to be done?
Yeah, Bolsonaro is widely seen as anti-environmental protection. He is strongly aligned with economic groups and special interests that are in favor of deforestation, much of it illegal. A lot of his policies have been about non-enforcement of environmental regulations. So about 80% of the Brazilian Amazon is owned by the public sector, or in some ways public land, or under protection of indigenous reservations. And there's widespread encroachment, illegal, like theft of land. And he is known for trying to prevent enforcement of Brazilian environmental law. He also has discontinued funding for the the National Institute for Space Exploration. So Brazil's National Institute for Space Exploration existed entirely to monitor the Amazon with pretty sophisticated, detailed satellite imagery of the Amazon rainforest. And he gradually discontinued funding for the National Institute for Space Exploration, and then ultimately has ended up entirely canceling this year the National Institute for Space Exploration's monitoring of the Amazon. So very likely, if President Lula is elected in 2022, Lula will reinstate the monitoring of the Amazon.
What are the major ethnic groups in Brazil, and sort of how percentage of the population, like how many are indigenous people, how many or what other groups there are?
Yeah, indigenous people are a very small percentage of the Brazilian population. So I don't know, maybe under 5% of Brazilians are indigenous. Somewhere around 2 to 3% of Brazilians are indigenous. The major ethnic groups. So Brazil was had brought the highest percentage of African slaves from any country in the Western Hemisphere. So Brazil had a huge number of African slaves who were brought, enslaved people who were brought to the country, which led to a very high Afro-Brazilian population. Slavery was only made illegal in Brazil in 1888, and subsequently the Brazil's formerly enslaved people have mixed with the peoples of European descent. So there's a large mixed race population in Brazil. So the vast majority of Brazilians are somewhere on a color spectrum from between European and being of African descent. Historically, the majority of Brazilians identified as white, but as sort of understandings of race and racial norms have changed in recent years. It's now the case that slightly over 50% of Brazilians identify as Afro-Brazilian, or increasingly, people who did not historically use the word Black, but now increasingly people are identifying as Black.
You know, you spoke at the beginning about how he started writing letters to the editor, and he was complaining about wages being too low. And so what has he done in that area? I saw you're quoting him saying that he would not hire a woman and a man for the same salary. He says, seems like a terrible misogynist as far as that goes. But in any event, has he done anything economically to raise wages and to give the better kind of life to some people?
Well, yeah, so that's complicated. The Brazilian economy continues to be to be in very, very bad condition. I mean, COVID was really awful for Brazil, and mismanagement of the COVID situation was really quite awful for Brazil. And so the economy continues to do poorly. In that situation, there's high inflation in Brazil. While inflation is high in the United States, inflation is even higher in Brazil right now. And so the minimum wage has been rising, but not enough to keep pace with inflation. At the same time, most public sector employees have seen have seen no wage gains, with the one exception being Bolsonaro's core base constituency from back at the beginning of his political career. So we talked about how he was complaining that military salaries were too low. Interestingly, one of the few public sector areas where he has given massive where he has massively raised wages has been the public sector, has been the military. So this past year, his current budget for 2022, he something like a 30%, something along the lines. I don't have the number in my head, but it's about a 30% increase in the budget for the military, which came along with massive infusion of cash for weapons and military toys, and also massive increase in salaries for the military. So yes, he has actually raised military wages, which is the complaint that he started his political career on decades ago, which I hadn't really thought through the irony. But there's quite an irony, or a matching. There's a rhyme there. Yeah, from the beginning to the end of his political career. Yeah.
I noticed he had a military background. What rank did he ever attain?
He attained the rank of captain in the military. He subsequently was engaged in a rebellion where he was going to be dishonorably discharged, and after massive outpouring of public support from enlisted men in his favor. He was ultimately allowed to resign from the military without a dishonorable discharge. And his activism in favor of military salaries ultimately led to his popularity and to his an entree into politics as a city councilor in Rio de Janeiro.
I noticed he was a big friend of Mr. Trump's.
Yes,
I think. And how did he react to Trump losing the election?
He was pretty sad about Trump losing the election. He had a hard time with it. Not that there's a lot of need for the Brazilian president to campaign for any American presidential candidate, but to the extent that he, that he could, he really was campaigning for Trump, and certainly he was not very popular at the time of the 2020 election.
I trust he didn't come to the
from Bolsonaro was going to really help Trump, but he certainly was widely known as a supporter.
Well, at least he didn't come to the Capitol on January 6th. I guess that's a good thing. Yeah.
No, he didn't come to the Capitol on January 6th. Though he and his family were personal fans of Trump. For instance, when they visited Washington, D.C., his adult children bought Make America Great Again caps. Were excited to get pictures with Trump, et cetera.
One final question someone has. Are there oligarchs in Brazil like Putin has in Russia?
Yeah, they're certainly very wealthy people. Absolutely. Oligarchs like Putin's oligarchs with that kind of economic power? No, not really. There are extremely powerful and wealthy old money landowners. I wouldn't say that they are the kind of economic or sort of political support base for Bolsonaro or for authoritarianism in Brazil that one would find in Russia. There's not really an equivalent. I would say they're extremely rich people, but not of the kind with the kind of political importance that one would find in Russia.
Yeah. You mentioned and you showed the chart of all the religious services that some of the evangelical churches have. Seemed like almost hourly there was some religious service. And is this true all over the country, or would that just be in the main cities? Or
Well, yeah, sure. In a small town, there's less demand for an evangelical church. So yes, there will be fewer services in small towns than in medium-sized cities. That's a poster from a city that has 300,000 people in it, so not a very large city. There's, but yes, all across the country we find that kind of effervescence, religious intensity, religious activism, particularly among evangelical and Pentecostal churches.
Well, it's, given all of that's happened in that country in the last few years, I guess it's not surprising that maybe a lot of people have sort of turned to that kind of religion as something to look at, and some of it's sort of mystic ways and so forth and so on. Yeah. Well, we've run a little bit over the time we told you, but it's been really interesting. I've learned a lot. I didn't know much when we started, and but it's been really interesting, and I'm interested in reading your book too, because I think it would even be more in depth, of course, in some of these subjects. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody. I'm really sorry about the technical problems. Which
well, it wasn't your fault, that's for sure. Yeah. But I'm sure people will then go and listen to the recording and all, so they won't miss too much. All right. Thank you so much again.
And if anybody needs to get in touch with me, my email address, I think it was in the last slide. It's aesmith2@Iowa State.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and good night.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.